from D1641, correct. Yeah. So just in summary, there are several species at risk of extinction, and others that are not listed as endangered have suffered severe declines. The viability of those species is strongly influenced by flows into, through, and or out of the delta, all of which are impacted by this potential temporary urgency change. The TUC petition and the executive order dramatically increase the risk of extinction, and they represent unreasonable effects on fish and wildlife. And I want to remind the board that you have an opportunity of, by sticking with D1641 because of the rains that we got in February, of potentially providing much needed relief for both salmonids and pelagic species and those who depend on them by reverting to D1641 now and allowing the flows to do their work.
Can we go back to the slide that's got the lightning bolt?
The lightning bolt. This one?
Okay.
Yeah.
With the D1641, I don't know where all the water is going to come from to meet all these needs. So I must be missing something.
Right. So the water, as far as I understand, exists to meet the 1641 standards. Right. We're talking about increasing exports above human health and safety levels. But I'll set that aside for a second.
Exports of natural and abandoned flow, which is a separate issue. I mean, you've got cold water needs here. So if you release from storage water in order to meet D1641, what's going to happen to the cold water needs?
Right. So let me address that, because I think it's a point that you all have been trying to get to all day, and I definitely don't want to be misunderstood here. We need to do everything that we can to protect all of these endangered species, and the conflicts between them and their needs for water are vastly overstated. Okay, they need the same water. To the extent that there is a conflict, right, we need to do everything that we can to protect the endangered species and not take actions that don't work. Meaning, if last year's scenario, everybody operating under good faith and doing the best they could, if we had known, and I think we could have, that it wouldn't work, then that's not the course we should have taken, right?
And
so that could have meant storing more water behind Shasta Dam and releasing it more to benefit the fish. Okay, I mean, your retrospective will tell you about this. Or it could have meant that if you had realized in February or March last year, if the results had said, there is no way that you will store enough cold water pool to fully protect winter run Chinook salmon throughout their life cycle, then I would not have recommended trying to do that, using the water in that way, because you would not have, if the evidence says you're not going to accomplish it, then trying to accomplish it and failing damages both the out-migrating winter run in 2013, you don't accomplish the savings you're trying to achieve in 2014, and you're damaging the pelagic species as well. So it's a matter, I think, the answer is to demand and get a full plan and accounting of water from the water storage agencies, and don't necessarily believe their water models or build in a factor of or their temperature models, build in a factor of safety so that you know that if they say they're going to meet a standard, they're going to meet the standard. I mean, that water model hasn't, that temperature model hasn't worked in the 24 years that I've been working in this system, in dry years. It doesn't predict accurately. So I think you need to figure out in advance what is the likelihood that we will actually accomplish protection of cold water pools sufficient to protect winter run Chinook salmon incubation and migration downstream, right? And then I'm requesting that you do everything you can to make sure that that actually works. Mm-hmm. And if it's not going to work, then you have your answer.
I don't get it. I don't get it. How do you meet D1641 and have a more restrictive, well, not more restrictive, I guess a temperature model that would result in more water being held back?
Can
so
I just, well, let me ask a different question. How can you relax the D1641 standards, which were designed specifically to share water between beneficial uses and provide a much-needed boost to both pelagic species and migratory species as they are in the delta, as they exist in their life histories in the delta. How do you relax those standards and then assume that that relaxation is going to result in protection of upstream habitat, maintaining temperatures? Because unless you have the assurances that that's actually going to happen, I'm not sure you really have a rational basis for doing that. And what we're suggesting here is that what we know is that species that live for 1 or 2 years are about as closer to extinction than they have ever been. So the water that we send down the river in March, we know will probably make a big difference for those species. And we also know that it will provide benefits for one of the 3 year classes of salmon that we're affecting.
I'm following you
Right,
there.
and so what we're saying is there's a calculus here to a certain extent, which is that we're actually getting greater benefit if we comply with D1641 for both salmon and pelagic species. But, if you and I totally understand where the question is coming from, are very concerned about maintaining upstream storage for upstream habitat, then I think before you make a decision, you better be damn sure that your decision is actually going to result in those protections upstream, because I do not have confidence.
So it's not a false trade-off?
Yeah.
If the trade-off is the
Yeah.
basis for the decision?
Yeah.
But in the end, it is a choice. You can't meet both.
You may not be able to. I don't know the answer to that.
Maybe.
What I do know is that in as we normally do, deferring to, well, we got to protect upstream. Well, we agree. We've fought many a fight to protect upstream habitat and ensure that there are cold water temperature requirements, et cetera, et cetera. But we also know that that is not just an automatic pass on degrading situations in the delta right now. I mean, yes, as you pointed out, Chairwoman Marcus, a lot of the declines have been long-term, but this year, I mean, the survey results as well as I do. We are, hanging on by a thread. And those decisions about whether we degrade the situation even further for those species, I mean, we could lose several species. I really believe that. So that's part of the calculation. So don't go too fast to the to just assuming that there's only one consideration here, environmentally. I mean, in terms of fish and wildlife.
I have a point of privilege. I have one person who's changed 2 plane flights and is going to have to change a third or possibly not get where they have to go. Do you mind if I take one person for 3 minutes?
Only if they agree with what we're saying.
I guarantee you they won't.
I'm fine with that. I don't know about the rest of my
Are you
panel members.
all right with that? I realize everybody's been waiting, but I want to accommodate this one because he asked. Mr. White? He asked nicely. Thank you for changing those other plane.
Chair Marcus and the board, thank you very much for changing or getting me in here so that I can at least give the point of view.
Be part of the NGO panel?
Yeah, yeah, and I agree with some of the stuff. Okay. First of all, I want to make a comment relative to exports in the Delta. There were no releases last year in 2014, and I don't think there were any releases contemplated in 2015 that were made specifically for exports. Now, that's the way that I'd like to see it happen, but
I don't know.
what has
anybody said
happened
that?
is that releases were made to the river for a multitude of reasons.
Right.
Temperature, other reasons.
Mm-hmm.
But water in the Delta was incidental and pumped because it was there, not because it was released to be there, if that makes sense. So all of the pumping that we saw, especially on the federal pumps through the summer, in fact, they didn't run a pump full-time in June, July, or August. It was part of the time. If they ran one pump full-time, they'd have 60,000 acre-feet a month. They averaged about 35,000 acre-feet a month in June, July, and August, which is a very critical time on the ag demand curve. So it was water that was incidental to the delta, not water that was released for that purpose into the delta. So in 2014, the economic situation in and around our service area was extremely tough. The early uncertainties in our water supply started with a 40% allocation, and the Bureau came back to us and said, well, geez, we think it might be a 5 to 15% allocation because of misunderstandings relative to last year's TUCP. Then we finally landed on a 65% allocation in May. The groundwater in our area, because of the lower allocation for us this year and because of the early TUCP, groundwater was stressed pretty significantly within our service area. Like Grasslands, who is on the downstream side of these cities, we're on the upstream side of these cities. Cities like Mendota, Firebaugh, Los Banos, Newman, Gustine rely on recharge from irrigation lands for the support of their aquifers in that area. There is a direct impact to that. We are the overlying AB 3030 management agency within that area. We do manage groundwater very, very proactively in this area. It has made it more difficult for us to manage the groundwater to sustain both agricultural and the small communities. Other impacts, looking to the east, it's well known that there's a subsidence issue that's occurring outside of our service area to the east. It's been exacerbated by the lack of CVP water in the area. Talking subsidence at the rate of about 1.5 feet per year, very significant. Looking to the south, another area with a lack of surface water supply, pumping deep wells from beneath the cork and clay, causing up to 1/4 of a foot presently along the Delta Mendota Canal of subsidence annually. That jeopardizes our long-term water supply into the area. If you can't maintain freeboard in the canal, if you're sinking the middle of a canal and you're not sinking the end of it, you can't push water through it. We're seeing that developing on the Delta Mendota Canal as well. Our reduced water supply has led us into a position of not being able to transfer water this last year and potentially not being able to transfer water this year. Our transfer support level 2 supplies to the refuges, level 4 supply to the refuges, and we do transfer water to our neighbors who are chronically short of water on an annual basis. And finally, I just wanted to say 100,000 acre feet, if it's 80,000 acre feet or if it's 100,000 acre feet of reduced exports by not allowing the transitional pumping, it's probably a new term, transitional pumping, this year, that quantity of water could potentially mean the difference between the Bureau having to make a call on Friant and taking all that water down to San Joaquin or an allocation to the Friant districts. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Sorry. Where are we between the two of you? Was that the transition?
Yeah, that was
Okay.
the transition,
Okay.
yes, where I wrenched the microphone away from John Rosenfield and
Being my own timer.
and ran down the field
Yeah.
right into the goalpost, I think. But Gary Bobker, Bay Institute. Just a couple of preliminary things. We are protesting the petition and objecting in part to part of the executive director's order. But I want to start by saying that there's no doubt in my mind that Tom Howard thinks these things through very carefully and has the best intentions for all beneficial uses and users, and this is a very difficult thing. So I think reasonable and rational minds can disagree on this, but he and the rest of the staff have nothing but the highest respect from everybody here, certainly the Bay Institute. Secondly, this order, whatever form it's in, is not going to solve everything. I mean, we heard, my heart was moved by the stories that farm workers were telling. I mean, you'd have to be a stone not to be. But what you do is really not going to solve the problems that they're encountering. Well, you can testify to that when you get up, Jenny, but this is my time. The order's not going to solve the ecosystem problems either. I mean, it's not going to reform water management or change contracts, et cetera. I mean,
Or reduce D1641
right.
in place of our phase 1, 2, and 3.
Right.
And 4.
So, the order is what it is. And the point of John Rosenfield's testimony and what Doug said, and I think the rest of the panelists, is that, number one, extinction is a real possibility right now. And the science basis for suspecting that is very strong. We think that the fish agencies kind of blew it a little bit by having a very narrow interpretation of what they were asked to do. But nonetheless, even if somebody disagrees with my assertion that the scientific basis is very strong, everybody says there's a lot of uncertainty. And uncertainty at the worst time we've ever experienced for many estuarine species, I think, is just really counsels extreme caution for the environment. You know, I do not trivialize the impacts to other uses. I simply say that I think extinction kind of outweighs a lot of things. I also think that, as you've pointed out, the board has a little higher standard than extinction, and I think unreasonable impacts are pretty easy to demonstrate. The whole point, as I was saying before, the whole point of D1641's outflow and vernal flow standards is to say that, you know, as they're designed to be hydrologically sensitive, and so both species and habitats have been hit very hard by the drought. And when the hydrology improves, there's a chance to proportionately improve conditions. And if we blow that, I mean, that's a pretty unreasonable impact in my view. And I think that the executive director's order rightfully recognized that if you increase exports while decreasing flows, that you're really kind of inviting, you're really inviting disaster at that point. On the other hand, of course, if we comply with D1641, there will be some opportunity to pick up some something from exports there. But I think, you know, the thought I want to leave you with is that, you know, we went through this last year. It didn't work. I doubt that you all are going to have a eureka moment and say the Bay Institute is absolutely right and we're going to change the order right now. Since you're not experiencing that enlightenment, or you may not experience it. It's
not an action moment.
Right.
We'll give feedback.
But in thinking about this, think about what is it that you really need to know before you, you know, whether you allow the order to stand as it is or you rethink this. And I think that given the risk to these species that are on the brink, I think given the unreasonableness of robbing them of the one ability to stem the downward trend, and I think that given the uncertainty of the lack of a real assurance that water that is saved by relaxing the standards is going to be used effectively, and in the way that we contemplated. I think you need to have a better handle on all of those considerations before you allow D1641 to be relaxed. And I will leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hello, board.
I'm sorry we ate up a bunch of your time, and you had 20 on that rather than half hour. I don't know why.
Yeah, if Doug OBG had told me it would be 10 after 7, I might have come, well, after lunch anyway.
That's pretty impressive.
I'm John McManus. I'm the executive director of the Golden Gate Salmon Association. We're a coalition representing both sport and commercial salmon fishermen.
Let me say, I'm going to ask each of you to try and be as succinct as you can, because there are a lot of people, they will listen to you far better if you are succinct.
Just trying to tell you who I am.
Yeah, I thought I'd do that before you got into the substance.
I think most people know, but I would like to state for the record that the California salmon fishery supports tens of thousands of jobs, multi-billion-dollar economic industry for both California and the Oregon coast. Much of that economic activity is not only on the coast, but also along the Sacramento River Valley. In fact, salmon are actually an important food for a whole bunch of working-class people who live in the Sacramento Valley. This isn't widely known, but I witnessed it myself over the last few years. I come today to ask that you not relax pumping standards that are currently in place. We've got a desperate situation on our hands. You've heard a lot today about the 95% loss of the winter run. And as John Rosenfeld pointed out, if 5% made it to Red Bluff, far fewer made it to the Delta. One of the things I'd like to flag is these fish are in the Delta and they're not going anyplace anytime soon. Well, let me couch that. They're going to stick around probably at least until April. And there's a reason for that. They don't go out into the ocean until there's something for them to eat out there, And there won't be much for them to eat until the northwest winds start to blow, which happens every April, and the krill blooms and plankton start to go off. So they're going to be in the danger zone in the delta for some weeks. In addition, in the next few weeks, the fall run is going to, juveniles are going to start coming down the river, and those are the fish that we rely on for our fishery. As far as I know, they're not even considered as part of the TUCP. And of course, the delta pumps pose a severe threat to them also. If juvenile salmon are pulled off their migration path into the interior delta, it's generally game over. And the National Marine Fisheries Service tells us for every juvenile salmon that shows up to the pumps, something like 6 to 9 more have been lost along the way. Without the fall run, we aren't fishing. We're out of work. We can't feed our families. We can't make our boat payments, our insurance payments, or house payments. Real briefly, I'd like to address a comment that I hear a lot, that water that goes to the ocean is wasted, because it gets under our skin for those of us who live out on the coast. To us, that water is a conveyor belt. It's carrying juvenile salmon, which are a precious cargo. They're lousy swimmers. They rely on that runoff to get to where they need to be, and if that water's diverted, they don't make it. I think the board knows this, but I'd like to just state for the record that losing these juvenile salmon in the Delta kills the future for families and communities tied to the salmon industry, both on the coast and in the Sacramento Valley. Killing the baby salmon is killing the jobs of not only commercial fishermen, but also river guides, tackle shop, boat shop, and charter boat owners, marine electronic businesses, and untold numbers of restaurants, grocery stores, and motels all over the state that cater to the salmon fishermen. And I've seen a lot of economic activity go through all those types of businesses. It's clear that here in California, we promised water that in years like this simply isn't here to deliver, so hard choices are being made. We know that by the testimony we heard this morning. We hope and would like to think that legal standards are in place to settle such questions. We've heard reference to 1641. Obviously, all Californians are now looking to the state board to provide the leadership that we need to get out of this. We're stuck, I think we're all stuck, with an inherited water allocation system that simply promised too much water to too many. It's destroying the Bay Delta, as evidenced by the testimony you've just heard here. It's destroying our salmon runs, and as we heard earlier today, it looks like it's hurting working class families in the San Joaquin Valley. So it's clear that everybody here is under intense political pressure, including to weaken the existing pumping restrictions, and we hope you don't do it.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Rachel Zwillinger, speaking on behalf of Defenders of Wildlife. Thank you all for giving this matter so much attention today, and I'll be very brief. We realize that everyone has been hit hard by water shortages, that we've heard today communities and businesses are clearly suffering, but we can't overstate how bad the situation is for native fish that depend upon the Delta. As others on the panel have explained, several species are teetering on the brink of extinction and may not be able to withstand the harms caused by the requested relaxations of our water quality standards. We believe that while some of the measures requested in the temporary urgency change petition are reasonable in light of this desperate situation, we strongly believe that safeguarding imperiled fish requires limiting exports to 1,500 CFS when D1641's requirements aren't being met. We also want to emphasize that fish are not the only species suffering because of the drought. Because over 90% of California's historic wetlands have been destroyed, migratory birds and other species like the threatened giant garter snake rely on managed wetlands and wildlife refuges to meet their habitat needs. The drought has reduced the quantity of water delivered to these refuges, and the remaining habitat is insufficient to support thriving populations. But though the situation isn't ideal, these wetland-dependent species at least enjoy the basic protections provided by the Central Valley Project Improvement Act, which requires that reclamation deliver at least 75% of the refuge's level 2 water supply needs, even during a drought. our fisheries don't enjoy such a clear and unequivocal water supply mandate, which is why the water quality standards that are at issue today are so vitally important to the survival of the species. So, for that reason, Defenders believes that to safeguard public trust resources and to protect the public interest, the board should limit water exports to 1,500 CFS when D1641 requirements aren't being met. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Hi.
Thank you, Chair Marcus and members of the board, for the opportunity to speak to you today. I have just a brief point to make. I'm bringing up the last of the last here.
You should state your name, though, for
and
the
I
record.
will state my name. I am Darcy Lewis. I'm with Friends of the San Francisco Estuary. We are a nonprofit organization founded in 1994 to promote implementation of the Comprehensive Conservation and Management Plan for the San Francisco Estuary, which was a collaborative multi-agency blueprint for the restoration and management of the estuary approved by the US EPA, and that's what brings us here with our colleagues today. We appreciate the State Board's efforts to balance the needs of endangered species, farmers of different regions, fishermen, and other users of Delta water supply during this exceptional drought by acting to conserve upstream storage for use later in the season and the other actions that have been taken. And we would just like to remind State Board members, staff, and others, however, that Delta outflows aren't only essential for endangered salmon and smelt, but also for drinking water supply for estuary residents and for the health of the San Francisco Bay. Shorelines and marshes throughout the bay are eroding due to the entrapment of sediment behind levees and dams, and due to a lack of sufficient flows to move it out of the delta and into the bay. The bay's wetlands and marshes provide vital flood protection for our shoreline businesses and habitat for a wide variety of wildlife, including listed species and migratory birds along the Pacific Flyway. Furthermore, water quality is a major and expensive concern for our more than 20 wastewater plants and our over 100 communities in the bay. Freshwater inflows to the bay from the delta, especially those pulse flows from large winter storm events, help improve water quality and help the bay, including the South Bay, meet federal and state standards. 6 of the 9 Bay Area counties and the Association of Bay Area Governments have all passed resolutions calling for improvements to the current freshwater delta outflow regime. We urge the State Board to maintain D1641 requirements except as needed for critical human health and safety, cold water fisheries, and water temperature protection, and to reject requests for increased non-emergency exports during this critical time for the estuary. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Questions? Thank you very much. Next we'll move to Steve Chedester, Executive Director of the Exchange Contractors. Oh, followed by, now this could take a while, just because I know, and I'll save the ones that didn't. Charles Bucaria. Is Charles Bucaria here? Okay, you're next up. Mr. Chedester, thank you for staying and listening to everybody all day.
Good evening.
Those of you who stayed, I really appreciate it because I do think it's important for everybody to hear everybody if they can. So.
I know Tom left, so I wanted to be able to just harass him a little bit because of being at 7:20 and bringing a little levity. Is that either Tom was just ingenious when he did that TUCP right when the flood was coming or the storm, or he was really lucky. I don't know which yet, so we're going to find out here pretty quick. But I mean, it was pretty good. So, you know, Chris pretty well covered what we wanted. We submitted our comments. We fully support the comments that were submitted by State Water Contractors and San Luis Delta Mendota Water Authority. Because of the time, probably just want to say maintaining flexibility, the most that you can do is what we're looking for. Our comments earlier were that a little bit of export does make a big difference. I still haven't figured out this difference between what you have and your responsibility and what the fishery agencies did. I mean, I've heard it a couple times, but I'd like to hear the responsibility of reasonableness test. I mean, because again, when I go and ask you to do something and you give me your informed professional opinion that said, I ask you a question, you answer it, I take it and say, okay, it's either good or bad. So when the fishery agencies gave the concurrence letter, or letters, 3 of them, to the project operators, I think we all thought, all right, that
And
was our
many
battle.
people thought that, yes.
And that makes sense. We're not asking to shut water off to everything. They're asking for a little bit increase and be flexible in how you can do the exports. Probably do some ramping. So if you can't do the whole thing, maybe you'd look at an in-between step. Let's do a midterm export, okay, or something like that. But we need to make sure we keep that flexibility there. Also, can't emphasize enough, 100,000 acre feet additional export, assuming it goes to CVP contractors. It makes a difference where you have this room full of people again that don't have any water supply or not, could this year for calls on water from Bryant.
No,
So,
of course, and the argument back is that it could be the end of a species. So it's sort of a,
well,
and even
could-
that, you do have the opinion of the
Yeah.
fish agencies on that, but then, again, you ask the question, I can let Mr. Laufer answer it, but we are supposed to be the keepers of the health of the estuary, maximizing beneficial uses. That's what we do. We don't, as I said, we don't get to pick one to throw over the, over the railing. We don't get to pick our favorites, and that includes the health of it, recreational fish or commercial fish, the non-endangered species too, which is what a lot of people have been talking about today. So it's a slightly different standard, and that issue of reasonableness is definitely subjective in some way, but it's not nothing. And so that's it's definitely hard, but I think people made an assumption not looking at what you're asking to do in a temporary urgency change is change a water right condition on a permit, which has sort of higher standards, went through these huge hearings. So it's just different. I want to say it's better or whatever, it's just different.
I've spent probably 45 of those 82 days
I believe
at
you-
the
you were probably there.
D1641 hearing, so I remember those very well. But what I also did hear, though, was there might be additional impacts. Can't quite say it. You think there would be, might. All right? I can guarantee 0% allocation to the west side or to Bryant. There are impacts that you can quantify. With that, I think that we ought to
Well,
leave my comment.
and this is helpful because I think you ought to be able to quantify it. And as far as the impacts, I think you ought to be able to analyze, now that you understand that there's a different standard that we need to look at. I'd like to hear it not just from the fish agencies, the NGOs, I mean, this is their area anyway, but you all have biologists and consultants and modelers that you work with. So I'd be curious to hear what they have to say about the standard that we are looking at, and that is unreasonable impacts.
So can we follow up on that?
I don't know what we have as far as, the opportunity for more comments, but
Well,
I-
at this point in time, I mean, we had a comment period that ran through I think it was last Friday, just to help shape this workshop. But at this point in time, we haven't set a rigorous deadline. We did receive a number of protests that were actually styled as petitions for reconsideration. And so I think one of the decision points that Executive Director Howard, staff, and the board may have towards the end of this day is whether there are specific, discrete, factual issues that we'd like people to address, whether the board chooses to hold an evidentiary hearing. I think there are some real issues that we'll want to talk through with trying to do that in a timely way. But certainly, if the board is interested, we could solicit further written comment on some of the discrete issues that have been fleshed out today.
But not a rehash of everything we've heard today.
Right.
Yeah, I mean,
certainly.
certainly listening to the board over the course of the last 11 hours, there are issues that you are very concerned about, and that there's not a lot of clarity in some of the testimony that's come in, and so perhaps framing up some issues for some very surgical comments from parties could help both staff looking at this issue and potentially further illuminate the issue for the board members.
So we'll talk about that at the end. Hope that's somewhat helpful, and then you can always call also Mr. Laufer for more.
I'm sure he'll hear from us.
He's allowed to talk to you about it, we just aren't.
I-
other than
that's why I
here.
asked the
Which is
question.
why, I'm sorry, some people think this is a long day, but this is the only chance that we're together.
Hey.
So.
It's good. So just want to make sure it's
Yeah.
clear, you understand that
Yeah.
we definitely want you to reconsider the original proposal.
Right.
All right.
And one more thing, sorry. One of the things that I think is crucial, regardless of allocation, is the ability to be able to transfer water. And we know that that occurred last year from Northern California to south of Delta, especially because there was that language in the TUCP last year that protected those transfers. But I don't know if you can comment now or if you want to think about it, but if this ramped pumping is allowed, then what will that do to your ability? Because I think that with you being senior and the refuges, what would it do to your ability to be able to transfer water?
If we can get enough water south of the delta that we know soon enough that it's secure, which again, if we can predict hydrology, that's going to be, that's part of the deal, right? But, you know, that allows us to be more flexible, whether it's a direct transfer or some other flexibility we may have with well fields. But we have to have that certainty first before we go out and make commitments to other folks who are going to count on that. Rest assured, our growers are the same growers on the west side that are some on the east side, and the refuges, we're all interconnected. If we have the flexibility, we proved it last year, we'll do what we can while still maintaining, you know, the integrity of our infrastructure for our growers. So again, flexibility, security, and then we can start making some plans.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chester. Mr. Bucaria or Bucaria? Did I just get it wrong?
If you're in Italy, it'd be Bucaria.
Yeah.
We're here in the United States, it's Bucaria.
Bucaria.
Thank you very kindly.
Great, and you're followed by Ronald Forbes. Is Mr. Forbes here? Forgive me for doing this, but just so somebody knows.
I'm sorry, he had to leave early.
Oh, so you know him and he
Yep.
had to leave. I just want to keep these, may have to send. And Dave Puglia, where are you? He had to go. I just want to get to the next person. Jack Castro. He's from Huron. He's probably long gone. Daniel Haggerty. Do I see you anymore? No? Oh, must leave at 2:30. There you go. Cindy Gao. Oh, there you go. You're next. Thank you.
I have been blessed with being able to be part of this life in April, 81 years, and I can date myself back to just prior to the construction of Shasta Dam. I spent 9 years of my life professionally working for the Department of Water Resources during the water project years. I have seen the fishery resources of this state diminish from the movies I saw in grammar school where you walked across the backs of the salmon and steelhead that were in our rivers to the point that we're at today where we're talking about slicing between the difference of 99% and 100% failure in our runs of various types of fish. I see no alternatives for a board such as yours, and I've sat on these types of boards myself, but to be as conservative as possible with the fishery resources that we have left. We don't have much, but we're not going to have anything if it keeps going on the way it is. And I don't want to be part of the generation that said, I let it happen. And that's the reason why I'm here. I've got a couple of points that I'd like to make to you. First of all, were I in your shoes, I would not cede my authority to the Department of Water Resources or to anyone else. You've shown me by your questions, your careful questions today, that you understand the issues and you can deal with those nuances to the extent that your authority allows you, and your brain power, which is certainly here, will give you direction from the facts that you receive. So don't pass on your authority to others. A second point is that the proponents of additional water releases are asking your board to totally ignore the supply factor of a supply-demand equation. As we've seen over the years, demand for water is inexhaustible. The supply is exhausted. To use a term that I, as a real estate economist, have become familiar with, we've overused the carrying capacity of the field that we're grazing in. And we've got to get back to carrying capacity. This state only has so much water, and there isn't going to be any more of it created. So we've got to be careful about what we're using so we don't overuse the range. The governor at this point has asked our urban areas particularly to reduce their usages by 20%. And many have tried, many have failed, and some of us in the Sacramento area particularly have been successful in that area. Your board has asked us in this area to clean up our act and get the water quality that we push through our affluent systems straightened out, and it's long overdue, and I'm just most pleased that you finally made that move on us. But the thing that I'm concerned about is, what are we going to do about agriculture? As we speak, there are ranchers, and I'm an ardent free enterpriser, but free enterprise has to have constraints on it. There are ranchers who are in the process of putting in new orchards, new almonds, new pistachios, new olive orchards, and this is taking place in the San Joaquin Valley right next to I-5. It's taking place up in the northern part of the state, where we're not even, as part of this discussion, really giving more than a casual, hi, how are you, with the exception of the CSPA folks who are pointing out that there's a lot of water that's going off stream out in that area, and I can tell you a lot of it's going into this orchard production. Until this drought is over, it would seem to me to be an appropriate act to ask the legislature to establish a mechanism under which new orchard plantings, new permanent vineyards, high water use crops would be constrained, and cotton is among them certainly, would be constrained in manners which would allow those orchards, those vineyards that are currently under production to be able to receive at least some minimal amounts of flow without having to share it with new developers, because that's exactly what these people are. My grandfather was one of them in the early Martin Pixley area. He was from Santa Ana, but he came up, and my uncle was a land leveler guy, and they developed a decent ranch, which they put into alfalfa, and then when it was 2 or 3 years old, they dumped it to the next guy who's probably got water from a better supply than they had. We've got to come to the point where we put the supply in order. And right now, you're not talking about that, and I'd like to ask that it be part of your future conversation. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much for joining us, and again for staying all day. Cindy Gao from Santa Clara Valley Water District, followed by, oh, we've already had Rick.
Yes, good evening.
Sorry,
Chair.
I just want to see who's next. Next is either Danny Merkley or Chris Shearing from the Farm Bureau. Sorry, Ms. Gao.
Okay, good evening, board members. My name is Cindy Gall. I am the Imported Water Unit Manager at the Santa Clara Valley Water District. The Water District serves 1.9 million residents and the economy of Silicon Valley. Today you've heard a lot of comments from the agricultural community and the environmental community, and I'd like to share with you an urban perspective. For the past several years, there has been so little local water supply available to our county that more than 90% of the water supplied to our drinking water treatment plants is imported from the Delta by the Central Valley Project and the State Water Project. In normal years, Delta supplies provide about half of the water we recharge to our groundwater basins. But for the past year, there's been so little supply available that our local creeks and ponds, most of them are completely dry. And this has significantly impacted fish and wildlife habitat in those local streams. Our retailers have relied heavily on groundwater to meet demands. Groundwater reserves were reduced by nearly 80,000 acre-feet in 2014, and water levels exceeded the subsidence threshold in one area of our county. And currently, groundwater levels are approaching subsidence thresholds at several locations in our county, and we are very concerned that permanent land subsidence may resume. Historically, Santa Clara County experienced up to 14 feet of subsidence in some areas, and that's resulted in residential communities, major business campuses, and critical facilities currently below sea level. One example is the San Jose Wastewater Treatment Facility, which cleans and treats the wastewater of more than 1.5 million people and serves the business sector with more than 17,000 main sewer connections. The levees that protect these subsided areas and infrastructure are themselves susceptible to damage from subsidence. As you may know, the district has been making great efforts to reduce water use in our county. And I won't go into that because it's getting late. But even with these efforts in place, there is a great need for more water this year, as you've heard. Now, John Lehigh had mentioned that the intermediate pumping level could provide an additional 100,000 acre-feet, up to 100,000 acre-feet south of the Delta. And Director DeAdamo has hit on a key point that I want to make, and that is that additional supply can bolster water supplies, lubricate the system, and excuse the pun, to help provide transfers, exchanges, and particularly banked supplies to our district and other districts that are in need of water. We've had a difficult time securing those supplies because there simply is not enough water in the system to make those easily available. The district objects to the denial of the intermediate pumping level. We do not believe the decision appropriately balances the certainty of impacts to water supply against the uncertainty associated with benefits to fish. And the existing biological opinions, as John Lehigh had mentioned before, for operation of the projects are in effect. They will continue to be in effect. The fish agencies under those opinions can already reduce the pumping levels below the intermediate pumping level if needed to protect fish. So we thank the executive director for approving the other components of the TUCP, but we respectfully request that the state board amend the order to approve the intermediate pumping level as originally proposed in the TUCP.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very much.
Can you talk a little bit more about how would the additional supplies help with your ability to access banked supplies?
Yeah, sure. The district normally puts water in wet years, water that we can spare in the semi-tropic bank down in Kern County. And we normally withdraw it in dry years when we need to supplement low water supplies. We bring that water out through a process of exchanges, basically. It's downstream from us. So the water is pumped out and exchanged with state water project supplies. And typically those supplies would be those that are available south of the Delta. So if we can provide more water south of the Delta, that will help us be able to retrieve those bank supplies. Okay, thank you.
Berkeley, followed by, wait, Alessandra Arredondo. Oh, I think she's on the bus too. Mario Resendiz. I think he's. Rosine Reynolds, are you still here? Thank you. You're next. Mr. Merkley, it's now your turn. Thank you for being here so much of the day.
This is easy. The legislature made me stay till 2 in the morning one time. I went home, had 3 hours to rest, shower, put on a new suit, and they kept me there till 2 o'clock in the morning the next morning. So this is easy.
This is nothing. Yeah.
Nothing.
Nothing.
Thank you, Chair Marcus, and board members Doduk and Diodamo, since you're lasting.